confuse people with the conversation.
So, do you want to go finish that conversation? I think probably that.
It's best left off camera.
Yeah, let's just say it stunk. All right. Probably didn't taste good either.
No.
All right. So, we've talked about praying to get to know God better. And we've talked about how our perception of God and our concept of God affects how we relate to Him.
Yes.
So, as a third part, I guess we could say in this series of wanting to get to know God better and to affect our perception of Him to the point that it actually changes our lives, it's also going to change or affect the way we worship. So,
part of that worship being, of course, prayer.
Yeah, it's gonna change the way we pray. And I think about that when I think about, how do you think about how we talked about God relating to us as a father to children as one example of His relationship. So we think about how different children relate to their father.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always amazing to me to see in family. I mean, you have some where there's one child in the family, but the more children there are in the family, the more you see the different ways of relating to the father that there are. And, you may have in the same family, you have one who thinks this father is just the greatest person in the world and wants to talk to them and spend time with them all the time and everything. And then you have another kid that thinks that this father is the absolute worst person in the world and wants to run away from home to get away from.
Stop calling me out like that.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, how does that, I mean, he's the same person.
Yeah.
And yet they're relating to him differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the case with God as well, where because we have these different images of who God is,
Mm-hmm.
because we see a different side of Him, or because of our own personality and our own way of interacting with others, we react to Him differently than other people do. And I'm sure that there is a perfect way, a right way, a good way to relate to God. And I mean, Jesus showed us that, But I guess what I would say is,
But the other part of that is, since we are all different, that best way of interacting with God may also be different for a lot of us.
Yeah, to some degree there will be some differences because we're different. And also part of it too, we're going to be in different places of our growth and different places in our relationship. Somebody who's just learning about God for the first time versus somebody who's been having this intimate relationship with Him for 40 or 50 years since they were young, and grown to that point. So those are going to affect things. And we shouldn't expect that our relationship with God and our prayers to God and whatever else, our worship of Him is necessarily going to be exactly the same in our mind as other people's. Now, when it comes to worship, there are certain things where He's prescribed, this is the way you worship me. And we need to learn those things. Those are the basic things. I think about Acts 17, where Paul comes upon some people who worship so many different gods, and he says to them in Athens, I found an altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship without knowing it is who I proclaim to you. And so he's going to teach them about this God that they did not know. And when they learn that, it's going to affect that. So what are some things that as we learn about God and we get to know God better, what are some ways that's going to change the way we pray? Now, obviously, we've already talked about, our boldness and our respect and our openness and all those kinds of things. But are there some specific examples of some ways that someone is going to pray differently depending on how they view God? And that's what we kind of want to think about for a minute.
I've been thinking about this for a little bit because I figured you were gonna ask something along those lines, and of course we've been talking about Psalms off and on, where we're just like practically all of the Psalms are prayers, and David wrote a lot of those. And in thinking about David, David was a warrior king. So a lot of his psalms go something to the effect of defeat my enemies, avenge me of my enemies,
Defend me from my enemies.
yeah, those sorts of things.
Protect
And
me.
it's all very God is the mighty warrior focused.
Yeah.
Because David was a warrior. He knew how that worked. And was he wrong that that's who God is? No, that is a part of God's character. God is a warrior. And if you don't believe us, I mean, look at some of the Old Testament. God sent the Israelites out and went in front of them fighting battles
Absolutely.
all the time.
But that also wasn't his only way of viewing God.
Exactly.
Because we also see him writing like the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd.
And see,
which is a very different psalm than the others that we talked about.
That's another thing is, who was David? David was a shepherd. So he understood God is like a shepherd. He guides me, he protects me, he cares for me and provides the things that I need, and all of these things
just like
that a
I
shepherd
did for
does.
those sheep.
Yes. And so I think one of the interesting things about understanding God and praying to him is that at some point in your life, you will have done something that is a part of God. You
That's a similar,
that's a similar.
You've done
part
something
of God.
that's a similar thing to what God. Yeah,
whether
you filled some relationship that is similar to the relationship that God has with us.
Whether it is like, whether it's like David and he was a shepherd, so he understood, hey, God's like a shepherd. Whether you're a mediator like Jesus is for us to the Father, whether it's a counselor, the person that you can just take all your troubles to,
whether it's you're a father yourself, or whether it's being a child who had a father. Jesus and God have that relationship, the father to the son. Or whether it's, maybe you were in a position of leadership, maybe you weren't a king or a judge, but every parent has to be a judge if the kid's fighting. But yeah, there's going to be some things where you're going to have some aspect of your life is going to mirror in some way God's existence. And so you will naturally gravitate toward viewing God in that way, I think. Yes. And that can be good in some ways because it helps you understand God better in that way. But it can also be problematic because then you may ignore the other aspects of his character.
What if what if David had not recognized that God was a shepherd? What if he only saw God as the fearsome warrior?
Yeah. Or
he would have treated God very differently.
Or only saw him as a king.
Yeah.
And not the tender, loving shepherd. But maybe a harsh king who didn't care about him. There's a lot of factors there. So as we think about that, we've looked at extremes, because the extremes are the easier things to see the differences. So the difference between, if you see God as this fierce, vengeful, mighty warrior who has no emotion and has no concern about you, but just is out there to fight and kill and destroy, you're gonna pray very differently to that God. You're gonna be now we talk, it's good to have respect for God and a fear in that sense, but you're going to be afraid sometimes to approach that kind of a God because, kind of like Esther going before the King Xerxes or Artaxerxes, or whichever one, Artaxerxes. But before her going before him, Xerxes, I guess it was. I always get those Xerxes, Artaxerxes. Anyway, so she goes before that king. She's afraid he could kill her, even though she's his wife. He could just say, "Off with her head," and that's it. And so, if we have that view of God, we're going to approach him very timidly and very uh, much fearful of how he's going to react to our prayer and our requests, particularly. On the other hand, if we view God, and it's sad to say, but I think there are some people who really, to be honest, they view God as their servant instead of recognizing themselves as his servant. They seem to think, and you see it in the way that they pray. They name it and claim it, and I'm just going to tell God what I want, and he's going to give it to me, and that's just the way it is because he has to do whatever I say, and that's a very warped view of God.
Yes.
But if we have that different, instead of him being the fighter warrior vengeful God, if we have him as he's just this guy that's up there like a vending machine, and I put the coins in, and out comes my candy bar, or my bag of chips, or my soda, whatever I ask for, he's just going to dispense it. Then that's good. Think about the difference in the way those two people are going to pray. The one is going to be scared to even really ask God for anything for fear that he might get mad because I asked something that I shouldn't have asked. We think about that. Think about King Solomon. And after he's established his kingdom, then his mother convinces his brother who had tried to rebel against him to come and ask. She comes to ask for Abishag, who had been their father's nursemaid as in his old age before he died, I guess you could say. Kept him warm. Anyway, so he comes and asks him, "Oh, can I have her as my wife?" And Solomon gets angry and winds up executing him for that. And it's just like, well, wait, all I did was ask for a wife. And so sometimes if people have that kind of a view of God, that if I ask him for the wrong thing, he's going to get mad and he's just going to cut my head off. They're going to be afraid to ask anything. On the other hand, they'll ask selfishly for all sorts of things if they think that God's just going to give them whatever. And so I guess that's kind of an extreme example, the two different extremes.
Mm-hmm.
And most people are somewhere in between those two extremes.
And I would say the middle ground, the balancing point of those two is God being the perfect father. In that, yes, we can ask him for things. He'll even allow us to ask for things that go against his will and aren't good for us. And as his father, when we ask for those things, he may even let us have them just to try and show us that it's not right for us, just to teach us a bit of a lesson as our father. But that is the balancing point, that he's not the timid, oh, here, just take whatever you want, and he's not always the warlike, well, you asked for the wrong thing and I'll strike you down. He's the father that
wants what's best for us always, and he's going to respond accordingly.
Yes, and whether that is punishment, whether that is giving us what we ask for, whether we deserve it or not, whether it is best for us or not, he is going to teach us.
Yeah. Well, and another thing about that too is, as the father, and as him being our father, he cares about what's good for us, and because of that, he's going to always do what's best for us in the long run, which may not seem like the best thing right at the moment.
Yes.
But also our relationship with him, if we're good with him, if we've been living right, if we've been doing the things that please him, then our relationship with him is going to be very different, and his response to our prayers is going to be very different than if we've been being rebellious. because he's not going to reward our bad behavior.
The good kid has a whole lot more leeway than the rebel that wants to run away from home.
Yeah, and well, maybe not necessarily leeway as much as influence to ask for something.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that of course sometimes pushes the rebel to even be more rebellious because they see, well, they get everything and I don't get anything, and that's kind of the Cain and Abel scenario, where Abel did what was right and offered what was right, and so God approved of it and God blessed Abel, and then that made Cain mad because God didn't approve of his offering. And instead of saying, oh, well, my brother did this, and if I do that, God would be pleased with me, he kind of rebels even further to the point of even killing his brother. So, yeah, we definitely need to think about, and we've just given just a couple of little examples. I mean, because God's so complex.
God is
so
incredibly
many.
complex. I mean, you're watching this, just think about how long you've been alive and all the different things that you've learned about yourself or about just people in that time.
And all the different jobs you've held and all the different things you've done.
And then you think about how God has been alive for eternity.
Yeah.
He has always existed and has always been the same, but still, from the way our minds think, the amount of, I don't know, character development, I guess, that can happen in an eternity.
Yeah. Well, just the amount of things the things he's done throughout the ages. Yeah, it's phenomenal to think about.
It really is.
All right. Well, and I know we didn't get too deep into it because we can't just lay out every single possible way that it's going to affect it, but it's going to affect the way you pray, and we need to recognize that, and we need to work on growing that to not allow a misconception of God or a warped perception or leaning so far to one aspect of his character that it causes our prayers to get slanted in that direction, and we don't ever think the other direction about it. All right, so hope this helped a little bit. Hope you think about now when you pray. Think about what is it about my relationship with God that makes me pray the way that I do, and examine that. Meditate on that. Think about that.
Now, there may be something there that a reason that you don't like being bold or open or some of the other things that we've talked about in your prayers because of a certain way that you view God or a problem in your relationship with him that needs to be dealt with.
And again, we talked about how your relationship with somebody else in that position, if you've had a bad relationship with a judge or a father or on down the line of things that God if you've had a bad relationship in the past with somebody in that position, you may have difficulty relating to God in that area. And it's something that can be a struggle, and it's something that we have to work on to try to correct those relationships and repair that relationship with God in the right way. All right, well, we will let you go, and I guess we're going to continue on with a prayer. I think we're done with Deuteronomy. We're getting close to done.
Yeah, I think we may have one more.
Yeah. Well, we'll see.
Maybe
you'll find out tomorrow.
Yeah. See you tomorrow.
Bye.